Today, I'm going to share with you the 5 steps it takes to break into investment banking. What's up everyone, my name is Ben and welcome to Rare Liquid, a channel where I draw from my experience as a former JP Morgan investment banking analyst to cover tech investing and career advice. In case you're new, the weekdays is where I post about stocks and crypto, and weekends are when I post about career advice, and I did not post a tech investing related video this past week because I've been pretty busy, but I will get back to it starting this following week. With that said, to provide you with a high-level overview of the banking recruiting process, here are the 5 steps I'll be talking about today. In case you're unfamiliar with my background, as I've mentioned in previous videos, I was the JP Morgan UC Berkeley recruiting captain for 2 years while I was an analyst at the firm. And so I'll be drawing from that experience and also just my experience actually recruiting for banking to provide you guys with all the tips today. I've also made a lot of other videos about investment banking in terms of how much money you make as a banker, why I quit investment banking, what a day in the life of an investment banker is like. So feel free to check out my investment banking playlist on my channel if you want to look for more videos about the topic. Alright, with that said, the first step to banking recruiting is to figure out your entry point. To get into banking, 99% of the time, you're either going to enter in as an analyst or an associate. I'll be providing my insights into these 2 paths, but before I do, I just wanted to make sure that you guys were aware that I'm mainly focusing on US recruiting for banking, and things may be a little bit different in Europe, Asia, Australia, wherever you're from. And if you do have some advice based on the country that you're from, then please leave them in the comments below. All right, so first off, let's talk about the analyst path. At least for bulge bracket and elite boutique banks, 95% or more of analysts come from undergraduate university recruiting. For undergrads, if you go to a top 25 college or so, then banks will likely focus on recruiting at your school, and you should figure out which ones that do because those will give you the best shot and have a structured recruiting cycle. And of course, if you go to a top 10 or 15 school, then your chances are much better and more banks will recruit at your school. Outside of that top 25, you'll have to rely a lot more heavily on networking and gaining good professional experience to break into banking as an analyst. In terms of the recruiting process, this is the general timeline that you need to know. Sophomore winter to sophomore spring is when the majority of the top banks start interviewing for junior summer internships, and banks fill nearly all positions by junior year fall semester. Then, if you do well during your junior internship, you'll receive an offer to join the firm full-time after college. About 80% or so of full-time offers are filled up by the internship classes at each bank, so it's really important, especially if you're in your first year or second year in college or maybe even in high school, for you to really start getting prepared ASAP in order for you to make sure you get that junior summer internship, because otherwise you're going to have to go through full-time recruiting where people who have worked at other banks are going to be trying to get jobs at the other better banks, and there just will be less spots overall available. Really quickly going back to the recruiting timeline, most of the spots are filled during August or September of senior year for full-time recruiting. Now, if you're 1 to maybe 3 years out of college and you want to join an investment bank as an analyst, I'd say it's probably really not likely, but there are 2 potential paths. The first is through a master's in finance or a similar degree that feeds graduates into banks. The second is through an internal transfer if you work at a different part of the bank and transfer into the investment banking division. I've seen both happen during my time at JP Morgan, but I do think that it's super rare. And so that's why I usually recommend that if you're a few years out of college to focus on the second path, which is through an MBA in order to become an associate. Really simply, you can join an investment bank as an associate, which is the level right above analyst if you attend an MBA program. Just like for undergrads, if you join a top 25 MBA program, then you have a pretty decent shot of joining a bank. And if you join a top 10 to 15 or so program, then you have a really solid shot. So then the question becomes how to get into a top MBA program, and that's beyond the scope of this video, but basically the 3 things that you need are good professional experience, a solid undergrad GPA, and a good GMAT score. So just to summarize this section, the first step into getting into banking is figuring out your entry point either as an analyst or an associate. And if you are in your mid-30s or older or so and you're thinking about trying to break into banking as a lateral, kind of as an experienced professional, I'd say without that MBA, it's really hard to do so. And I'd say it's probably best to focus on other career opportunities just because you're going to be working 70 to 100 hours a week anyway, right? And when you get to that age, you probably have a family or something like that, and you probably don't want to be working that hard anyway. So I kind of focus your efforts on other career opportunities. All right, so let's next get to step 2, which is getting your resume banking ready. Now, this section of the video is mainly going to be for those who want to enter in as an analyst, because those who try to enter as an associate through an MBA, most banks already kind of figure that if you go to a top MBA program, then you pretty much have checked off the box there. And so you are smart enough and capable enough to become an associate at an investment bank. For example, at JPM, we had an associate who was from Stanford and he was a former Navy SEAL with no former finance experience. And then we also had another guy from Wharton who previously was a doctor. And so these people on their resumes didn't really have anything finance related, but they were still able to get their jobs because MBAs are feeder programs into banks. But for the analyst program, you're gonna be wanting to approach it very differently, and let's go into some of those tips. The first tip is to gain as much finance experience as you can, and this means working at smaller boutique investment banks, private equity funds, finance divisions within tech companies or any other type of companies, anything with finance experience. In general, bankers are pretty conservative when it comes to recruiting candidates and hiring them, because if you think about it, you're going to be joining an industry where it's normal to work 70 to 100 hours a week, right? And so we want to make sure that the candidates that we're interviewing and the people that we hire know what they're getting themselves into. And the best way to really show this is to show former finance experience. Now, because banking recruiting happens so early now during your sophomore winter, what I recommend is trying your best to get internships ASAP and as much as possible to really put yourself ahead of the pack. And for this, basically what I mean is try to make sure that you get a summer internship in some kind of finance related field, and also try to recruit and land internships during your fall and spring semesters in your freshman or sophomore year. The second resume tip is to participate in conferences and case competitions in order to add brand names to your resume. In regards to conferences, a lot of the top banks have 1 to 2 day programs where basically you get to learn about the firm and network with a bunch of bankers. And so it's just a really great way for you to learn more about the industry. And you can also just slap on that program that you went into under your honors and awards section on your resume. Most conferences are titled leadership summits, or there are also a lot of programs aimed toward diversity candidates and women. So if, for example, you search on Google for JP Morgan undergraduate conferences, you can see that this list shows up, and I would do this for each bank that you're interested in. Case competitions are usually 1 to 2 week long competitions where you form a group of 3 to 4 and you receive a packet of data and information from the company that's hosting the competition, and they have some kind of business problem that you basically need to analyze and create a 10 to 20 page presentation. You submit it, and usually 3 to 5 teams or so are selected to be finalists, and then you get to present your presentation in front of judges. Having these 2 things on your resume could be a really, really great way. Let's say if you're not able to get an in-semester internship at a bank or something like that, if you're able to have something like, a Goldman conference you went to and a Morgan Stanley case competition where you got second place or first place, then that already kind of really adds some good positive brand names onto your resume. And bankers love to see a lot of brand names because it's just kind of like a psychological thing when you're just looking through a resume and there's a bunch of companies that you recognize because they're, just top class companies or something like that. It really helps during the resume screening process. The third resume tip is to maintain a solid GPA, which generally means above a 3.5. For most of the top banks, a 3.3 GPA will be the cutoff point. And for example, at JP Morgan, when we were screening resumes, we never pretty much gave any interviews to anyone with a 3.3 or below, regardless of their major. So sorry if you're, doing a really, really hard major. Like, I know that math and CS and those kinds of majors are way, way harder than like business or econ, but you still need to have a minimum 3.3 GPA for those top banks. Even at a 3.5, I'd say you're still cutting it a little bit close. You want to aim for a 3.7 or above if possible. And to be totally transparent, I didn't have a 3.7 or above. I had a 3.6. I'm just telling you what it's like from a recruiter's perspective. And I personally had a lot of other professional experience that kind of made my overall resume stand out. So I think that's why I was able to kind of get my interviews. And so for you as well, if your GPA is not super high, then what I recommend is really focusing on the other parts of the resume to really make your resume stand out, mainly like adding more professional experiences. The fourth resume tip is basically to make sure that your entire resume is catered to banking as much as possible, and make sure that it's also formatted very cleanly, crisply, and nicely, because bankers care a lot about attention to detail. So you want to make sure that everything is spelled correctly and that everything is just structured the way that it should be. I go through a lot of my resume tips in this video here, so you can check that out if you're interested, and you can also buy my resume bank and templates down below in the description if you click the link, so check that out if you're interested. I'll also be launching a mini course on resume and cover letter writing, and so if you want to keep updated with that kind of news, then make sure to hit that subscribe button, and you can also sign up for my free daily newsletter where I'll be announcing a lot of those kinds of updates. All right, next up is step number 3, which is network, network, network. Networking in banking recruiting is super important because if you think about it from a banker's perspective, they're going to be working with you 70 to 100 hours a week. So they want to make sure that you are not only someone who will be able to get the job done, but is also someone who's likable and personable. In addition, for you, there are tons of benefits of networking, which I'll kind of go into a bit later. But just to give you an example, when I was at JP Morgan, when I met with a candidate that I really liked after a really good phone call or a coffee chat, I would really put them on the top of the list to get a first round interview. And in other cases, try to push that person to the final round, aka the super day of interviews. Over the past few years, the importance of networking has slightly decreased over time just because a lot of banks are now giving out digital interviews, which is where, as a candidate, you just simply record yourself answering a few questions that the banks give out. And then what the banks will do is review all of the candidates who have submitted this and then pick some of those candidates to go on to the final round of interviews. With that said, I will say that networking is still super important, mainly for two reasons. The first is that the banking recruiting process is a pretty holistic process. At the end of the day, human beings are the ones that are in charge of the entire recruiting process. Just because there are digital interviews doesn't mean that machines are, selecting the people or anything like that. And so basically what happens during the whole recruiting process when people are being selected to be given out offers is that the managing directors will give their feedback and the recruiting teams will basically come to an agreement together on which candidates really stood out in the entire process. But of course, with that said, I will say that the super day interviews and how you perform probably are like 80 to 90% of importance. But basically, if you were a really good candidate who networked with everyone really well, and there's kind of like a comparison of which candidate to take, but one candidate has networked with kind of everyone and really got to know the team and everyone likes that person a lot more, then that person will be given the offer. The second reason networking is important is that it helps you stay plugged in with the recruiting timelines at each bank, and the recruiting processes are different for every single firm and happen very quickly. Most banks have multiple recruiting rounds, and so for example at JP Morgan, I think we had 3 super days on 3 different months. So basically kind of 3 mini recruiting processes within an overall recruiting season. And if you're a candidate who has networked early in advance and spoken with a bunch of the bankers and they like you, then you can basically kind of be pushed forward and interview earlier versus everyone else. And that's really to your benefit because the spots at each bank, they get filled up very quickly. So the earlier you can recruit, generally the better. I'll make a separate video later on about networking, so I'll make my tips pretty short here with just 3 of them. But the first one is to make sure that you're first contacting people you know or alumni at your undergraduate school or MBA school maybe. And the reason for that is just because if you cold email or cold LinkedIn message people, they're probably going to ignore you just because they're so busy. The second is that when you're networking, you're gonna find that you may be interested in 10 to 15 different banks, and that's just a ton of people to talk to. So in general, I would try to really focus on quality over quantity. Maybe try to have 3 or so really quality conversations with each bank versus trying to talk to like 5 to 10 at each. Unless they're banks that you really want to work at and things are going super well, then try to talk to 5 to 10 different people. My third and a really important tip in my opinion is to treat your networking as conversations and really focus on getting to know each banker as a person. Don't try to just ask questions about work, really try to get to know them on a personal level. Let's now move on to step number 4, which is preparing for interviews. This can really simply be broken down into 2 parts, which are behaviorals and technicals. Starting with behavioral questions, these are just qualitative questions of people just trying to get to know you. So questions like, tell me about yourself, tell me about a team conflict that you were a part of and how you resolved it, why are you interested in investment banking, why are you interested in JP Morgan, etc. There is so much to dig into behaviorals and how to prepare for them properly, and so this will probably have to be another video on its own, but basically what I think is really important for you to kind of take away is to make sure that you craft your story and understand what your story is when you're networking and also when you're interviewing. So for example, very roughly speaking, my story was that when I was really young, I got interested in business because my parents were pretty entrepreneurial. So that's how I ended up studying business at UC Berkeley. And when I was in my junior year or so, I started investing in the stock market and realized I had absolutely no idea what I was doing, tried to build my own crude little financial models and whatnot. And after doing some research, found that investment banking was really the place where I could build a strong technical skill set. And so roughly that is what I would say during my, tell me about yourself question, or why are you interested in investment banking? But of course, I kind of tweaked it a little bit to make it sound all nicer and whatnot. Then the next thing you have to do to prepare for your interviews is focus on technicals. And these are questions about accounting, equity enterprise value, valuation, accretion, dilution, and LBOs. These questions may sound like they're a little bit intimidating, but I actually think that if you really enjoy preparing for your banking technical questions, or you don't have to like absolutely love them and like this is like what I was born to do kind of thing, but personally for me, for example, when I was recruiting for banking and reading through the technical guides, I actually found that a lot of what I was reading was just innately pretty interesting to me, right? And so I think that's a really good way to gauge to see if you are actually a good fit for banking. I've seen a lot of candidates who kind of want to join banking for the money or the prestige and whatnot, and trying to go into a career for those kinds of reasons will just not really work out, and those kind of candidates typically don't really end up getting offers. So to sum up this section, you'll want to prepare for interviews by making sure that you're prepared for behavioral questions and technical questions. And the last thing I want to mention is that you should try to prepare at least 3 or 6 months in advance of when the recruiting process begins, because there's just a lot of material for you to really go through. The fifth and final step is to crush the interview process. First of all, let's review the basic structure of the interview process, which will mainly be focused on the US, as I mentioned earlier, because I'm not super sure about what happens in other kind of countries outside of the US. For most banks, you'll go through first round interviews, either through digital interviews, phone interviews, or a mix of both. Then a small number of candidates are selected for final round interviews, where they'll interview with 4 to 6 more senior level bankers. To do well in these interviews, in my opinion, it comes down to 2 things, which is preparation and poise, which really feed off one another. We kind of talked about preparation a bit in step number 4, so the only thing I'll really add there is that you want to do as many mock interviews as you can, which I think is really the best way to feel as prepared as you can for the real thing. Now, when it comes to poise, the reason that it's particularly important for banking is just that when you're talking, especially with the senior level bankers in super days, these are going to be people who are constantly interacting with CEOs, CFOs, and really high up level people, right? And so these kind of people want to make sure that you're someone who, if they were to put in front of a candidate, then you would be able to maintain your composure, even if you're kind of pricked with some harder kind of questions. Now, I want to be clear that you don't have to get every single question right just to maintain your composure. You could be asked a question that you don't know the answer to, and you could kind of shrivel up and be timid or like brain freeze and not saying anything for like 30 seconds and panic, which would be pretty bad. Or you could kind of maintain your composure and still be confident by saying, to be honest, I don't know the answer to your question, but given what I know, I think my best guess is blah, blah, blah. And, if you're able to maintain that composure, then that'll still allow you to kind of be able to get that offer or move on to the next round a lot of times, even if you're not getting the question correct. The last thing and kind of tip I'll have for you here is that, I know this entire recruiting process, especially the interview kind of part of the whole thing, might sound pretty intimidating, but you should know that every single banker is, except maybe the 1 or 2 who are like power tripping, or, just you have the occasional person who's just not nice and wants to really grill you. Except for those kind of interactions that you might have, most bankers and people just generally just want to see you succeed, right? They want to be talking to candidates who are doing well, who they feel like they can hire. And so I always try to go into interviews with that kind of mindset mentally. And I think it really helped for me because it made it seem like, we were kind of on this team where we were trying to succeed together versus like seeing the interviewer as like an adversary or an enemy who's trying to like bring me down. And that just results in a much more kind of like colleague-like and friendly environment. And that's the kind of mindset you want to be in versus, trying to be, or versus being like very scared or intimidated by the whole process. Sorry, one more tip I actually do want to add is to try to be as genuine and authentic in your overall kind of persona and your answers as well. And so what I mean is for your behaviorals, the answers you give should be personal to you as much as possible. So no one else should really be able to say your answer to something like tell me about yourself or why investment banking, etc., etc. So make sure that those answers are very unique to you. Of course, for the technical questions, you can't really answer them in a super unique way. So for those, just try to really showcase your knowledge as best as you can. But just for overall, right? Like if you're not a super extroverted person, like personally for me, I'm a very introverted person at heart. And so it's not like I tried to be this super outgoing person because I thought that everyone in banking needed to be that way. I kind of just was whoever I was. And so for you, I would really recommend trying to do the same thing. With that said, as always, thank you so much for watching. Hope to catch you in the next one. Thanks so much and peace out.